Great, thanks Greg. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar today. I'll start by giving a bit of a background about the project and then we can get into it. So Paddock Power is an MLA funded project and we have two commercial collaborators on the Barkly, Brunette Downs and Rocklands station. So as Dione Walsh discussed in the last webinar, the concept of Paddock Power has been in the pipeline for quite some time. So Dione was leading the project when it first started up and she's since left DITT, but she's still been developing the investment calculator and the mapping tool the whole way through the project. Kieran McCosker has also been heavily involved from the start of the project and he's been doing a lot of the analysis. So I just want to thank Kieran and Dione for their contributions and support in keeping the project going. And I've now taken on the project to finish things off. And I just want to mention my colleagues, Kaz Pettit and Ben Worth from DITT. They've been a great support. So just highlighting that there are a lot of people who have been involved in the project and really grateful for all their efforts. So the overall aim of this project was to explore the impact that watered area has on productivity and to develop the mapping tool and the investment calculator to help producers make informed decisions and get the best bang for their buck out of infrastructure development on their properties. So the two overall objectives were to develop the tools which Dione went through in webinar 1. And that was 2 weeks ago, so you can find the link to that webinar on the Future Beef website if you missed out on that. And the second objective was the collection of commercial property data and to see how watered area might be impacting reproductive performance. So today I'm going to cover the data collected at the collaborating properties, and if you're wanting to find out more about the tools, I would encourage you to go and watch the recording of Dione's webinar. So this is just a quick look at the locations of the two commercial properties. Some of you are probably very familiar with these places, both on the Barkly tablelands. The Rocklands trial paddocks are actually in Queensland, just on the border of the NT. And this is a map of the two Rocklands paddocks that we used in the project. So Big Mudgee up the top there is the smaller, more well-watered paddock, and the less well-watered paddock, Grassy, is to the south. And these blue circles here are representing the 3 kilometre watered area for each of the paddocks. And this is a map of Brunette Downs paddocks used in the project. So you can see Fishhole paddock to the north is the less watered paddock, and the Connells paddocks to the south there. They've been split up in the last few years and they're now all around 95% within 3 k's of water. We just got the collars, GPS collars, back a couple of days ago from Brunette. So we'll be starting to look at this data in the next week, but unfortunately there is not any that ready for today. So we're going to focus mainly on the Rocklands data for the rest of the presentation today. So we had 2 main types of cattle data that we needed to collect for this project to be able to answer our objectives. Firstly, we needed crush side data, which was collected at each muster, and that included things like body condition, weight, lactation, pregnancy status. And then we also collected GPS data so that we could pair this with the crush side data to get a better idea about why some animals might be behaving differently to others and how this could be impacting their productivity. So I'll just explain quickly a bit about how the GPS collars work. They're designed based off collars that Central Queensland Uni have been using in a lot of other trials. They're fairly inexpensive, which allows us to have a lot more animals collared. The commercially available collars tend to be quite expensive, and this sort of limits the amount of animals that you might be able to capture data for. So the disadvantage of these collars is that they're not able to provide their location in real time. The data is all stored on board the collar. So what this means is that if a cow loses a collar, or the collar comes off somehow while the cow's in the paddock, you won't actually be able to retrieve any of the data that it's collected unless somehow the collar is found down the track. So just to give a bit of an idea about how we work out what cows are doing what, we combine the crush side data, so we'll allow lactation, body condition, weight and that sort of thing, together with the GPS collar data for each individual cow. So this gives us the distance each cow travels and also whether that cow is dry or wet, when her calf is due, her weight and that sort of thing. So we'll jump into looking at some of the results. First, we're going to look at the crash side data for each of the years. Then we'll look at some distance and distance to water data. And then we'll look at some home range data and some SIBO Labs data as well, along with that home range data. So we didn't see any significant differences between the two paddocks in fetal calf loss or in either of the years. So even though you can see that there are some differences in there with the tables turning a bit in 2023, swapping around a bit there with a slightly higher fetal calf loss in Big Mudgee, which is the more well-watered paddock. We'll go on to looking at some lactation data here. So this slide is looking at the lactation rate for the trial cows at the pre-testing muster. So we can see here that in 2022 there was a significant difference with 87% of the cows in Big Mudgee being wet, but only 60% in grassy being wet. This is probably due to the fact that we had more heifers in grassy and a more even split of heifers and older breeders in Big Mudgee. So obviously those heifers weren't going to be wet. And we can see that our pregnant within 4 months in 2022 was higher in grassy, and this is probably because in the previous slide we saw that the lactation was lower in grassy, and this is because there was a lot more heifers in this paddock, so a high proportion of the herd was not already lactating. So overall there isn't anything too exciting between the two paddocks. So we'll look at a few other things that might be more different between the two paddocks. We'll go into some distance now. So distance was calculated by the sum of daily fixes for each animal and showed that over the whole 3 years the animals tended to walk more in the bigger paddock grassy by about 1.5 k a day. And the distance that they walk tend to be highest at the onset of the wet season. So when the rain started, this is fairly typical when the animals are chasing fresh pick after storms and starting to move off the waters in search of fresh feed. So the distance then tended to be lower later in the dry season when the temperatures are hotter, feed availability is lower, and animals hang at the water points more so than in the wet when there's plenty of feed around, and also when there's more surface water available. So this graph here is showing the cumulative distance of trial animals in the first year of the trial. So it shows the difference between breeders and steers. Steers are in the right panel, breeders are in the left panel. You can see they travel fairly similar amounts, and that animals in the larger paddock grassy there, they travel further than those animals in Big Mudgee. So we'll start looking now at some distance to water calculations. So I just want to mention that we have identified some areas in the paddock that have substantial surface water availability throughout the dry season. So we're in the process of tweaking these results after the addition of surface water locations. So this graph is showing you the cumulative distribution frequency, or the percentage here on the left-hand side, the percentage of GPS fixes that are within a certain distance from water. So you can see here that we've selected the average minimum distance to water. So that's the average minimum distance per day that animals are from any one of the water points within the paddocks. So you can see that this shows that for 50% of the fixes, so halfway up here, we can see that animals were about 2.25 k's from water in grassy paddock, and then in Big Mudgee paddock, they're a little bit less, so 1.75 or roughly around that from water. So it's basically showing that in a larger paddock, animals are slightly further away from the water point. And this slide is also similar to the previous in that it's showing you the distance to water, but it's by month. So you can see how this changes month to month. You can see in the late dry season, sort of that August, September, October range, that the animals are closer to the water point when compared to the early wet once the rain starts. And this trend then continues on through the wet season when the animals might be relying more on surface water than the man-made water points. Okay, so now we're going to look a bit at some home ranges. So home ranges are basically a measure of where the animals spend the majority of their time. So it's calculated by, I guess, looking at the density of fixes and where they are occurring within the paddock. So as a general rule, you would expect the home range of animals to be smaller in the dry season when they have less to eat, spend more time at the water points during the day, and in the wet season when there's plentiful feed and surface water to spread out around the paddock, you would expect them to range a bit further. So you can see here that some of the home ranges of animals in both paddocks at Rocklands, one's in the dry season, so we've got big mudgy and grassy in February, and we've got big mudgy and grassy in October. So you can see that the smaller area is in October and the larger area is in February. So these, the polygons here are just representing the proportion of fixes. So the red ones are where the animals spend 50% of their time. The green ones within that area is where the animals spend 75% of their time. And then the blue areas are where the animals spend 95% of the time. So you could almost say that the animals are not really spending any time at all outside those blue polygons within each of those paddocks. So you can see that there's quite a big difference between wet and dry season home ranges there for both of the paddocks. So what does this data look like month by month? So these images are showing the home range of all the GPS collared animals in Big Mudgee Paddock for each month from August 21 to March 22. So just to flag that the February and March images have a lot smaller number of animals in the analysis because this was around the time that the GPS collars ran out of batteries. So this should be interpreted with caution because they might only be representing a smaller number of animals. So you might be thinking, what does this all mean and how does this relate to feed availability? Is there any sort of link between where the animals are and how much feed is around? So this is sort of now tying the two together a bit. We'll now have a look at some total standing dry matter and total cover estimates with the home range overlaid over the top. Now, some of these might be a little tricky to see a clear sort of colour because they're very colourful, so apologies for that. But basically, there doesn't really appear to be very clear pattern or home range based on the total cover. So in saying that, you can see that the two water points in the middle of the paddock are fairly well used, and that does show up in the total cover and also in the total standing dry matter there on the right. So if we look at that a bit more closely, we can see that the animals are mainly utilising that northern sort of half of the paddock in August. But then if we go to the next slide, which is in the wet season, so February the next year, we can see that the animals have moved to the southern end of the paddock a bit more. And they don't really venture up the northern end at all during February, even though you can see that it sort of appears there is a high total cover and also a high total standing dry matter. So there's a few things that I think we should go through with these results. So after a few dry years in the Barkly, the stocking rate was reduced in 2021 in grassy paddocks. So this might have impacted the results in terms of performance between the two paddocks that we're seeing here. So the utilisation rate was around 13.5%, which is below the safe rate of about 20%. So that means that the animals in grassy didn't have to travel that far from water to feed compared to the animals in Big Mudgee. So the results at the moment is sort of showing that the difference in watered area between these two paddocks is not enough to see big differences in reproductive performance, especially as the stocking rate was adjusted in one of the paddocks to compensate for some dry years. So I guess further to this, the watered area in both of these paddocks is potentially a lot higher than what it is currently presented as, because once we account for the presence of some surface water in the Georgina River, which runs through the middle of the paddocks, this might sort of alter a few of our results. So I guess overall, just take a few of these results with a grain of salt, because there are more things to come in this project. So some take-home messages from today are probably that we have a lot of factors at play here that are influencing our results between the different land types, watered area, surface water presence, and then also our management, so how we're stocking the paddocks, utilisation rate. So I guess the take home is focused on what we can control. So obviously after some dry seasons at Rocklands, they've done really well, looked after their country and cattle by reducing the stocking rate. But this also could be one of the reasons that we're not seeing that much of a difference between the two paddocks, even though they have slightly different watered areas. So this project's raised a lot more questions about how animals use paddocks, if there are strong relationships between home ranges, feed availability, and how this changes on a seasonal basis. So we have plenty more work to do in this space to get a bit further to the bottom of that sort of thing. So I think that is probably about enough from me today, Greg. Thank you. I'll flick it back to you.